homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm, or welcome back. Today we are making hard apple cider. And I got into making fruit wines many years ago, probably in the early 2000s, when I was living in the Four Corners area of Colorado. And I used primarily this book as my guide on making fruit wines, because there were lots of books on making wine from grapes, not a lot on fruit wines. At the time, I was specifically using only foraged fruit. So, people that have an apricot tree in their front yard and they're not doing anything with the fruit and it's just dropping everywhere. And I would go knock on the door and say, hey, you gonna do anything with that fruit? Can I pick a bucket? And so for the first 4 or 5 years that I played around with fruit wines, I only used fruit that I didn't have to pay for, which was fun. So it was fruit that I grew myself or fruit that I had foraged. And I had some good successes and I had some not so great. I made an incredible chokecherry wine that was very good. I did a peach wine that was very good. I did a raspberry wine that was very good. And then I had a plum wine that was not great, just needed some more different notes. It was kind of one note wonder. And then I quit doing it because I moved and I got involved in a whole bunch of other things and I started my own business. And so I haven't done it in a very long time. And so I just recently decided to get back into it. In this book on fruit wines, he has a recipe in here for what he calls perry, which is basically a hard pear cider, not a hard apple cider. And so I tried making some homemade perry and that worked out okay. And I played with some cider as well, some apple cider, and that was okay. But I always kind of got this fragrance of, I used to just call it feet. And the cider itself tasted fine, but it smelled very funky. And I used to think it was me and that I was doing something wrong. And then I would order cider in a restaurant where they were brewing their own. And it often also smelled like feet. And so it was just something that was going on with the cider itself and perhaps the yeast that was being used. And I didn't love the foot smell. And so I kind of got out of it for a lot of other reasons as well. And then this year we pressed some apple juice and there's a video on that. I'll put a link to it below. And in the US, we call apple cider just unfiltered apple juice, where it's cloudy apple juice. In most other parts of the world, when they say cider, they mean hard cider or alcoholic cider. So just a clarification there. But I decided to take some of that unfiltered apple juice, if you will, and make hard cider out of it because I already had quite a bit of canned apple juice from the previous year and I didn't really need a lot more of that on my shelves. And so for the first time in well over 10 years, I decided to make some cider. And because it had been a long time and a lot of things have changed, and of course YouTube has totally blown up, I decided to get online and just kind of review what I needed to know about making cider. I've also done some home brewing, so a little bit of beer making as well. So I have some equipment and that helps. We'll walk through some of that in this video. And what I found most helpful was this YouTube channel, and I think it's called City Steading Brewers. And it's just this couple, and they make all kinds of different brews out of their home, and they are really fantastic. And what I learned is there's some new techniques and tricks that I was not aware of from only having this book to rely on some 20 years ago. One is pasteurization. So instead of adding potassium sorbate to your fruit in order to kill anything and then letting it sit for 24 hours and then adding your yeast in order to basically kill off any wild yeast that are on there, they just simply heated the mixture and pasteurized it that way. And I was like, wow, not having to add another chemical, fantastic. And so I pasteurized this apple juice before I pitched the yeast into it. I did do a couple of small bottles where I didn't pasteurize it and let the wild yeast compete with the brewing yeast that I added, just out of curiosity to see how that would work out. I did have one of those bottles become very active and essentially volcano out of the bottle when I opened it. So live and learn. We'll talk more about that as we get into the video, but that was kind of crazy and fun. And then the other thing I learned is one of the things you do with cider making and wine making too, possibly, you want to do what's called backsweetening. And so the yeast ferments out all of the sugar that's available, and then it's very dry. Basically, there's no sugar left. It doesn't have a lot of flavor when you do that. There's alcohol in there, but it tends to be really boring in terms of flavor because the sugar is part of what transports all of those other fruit flavors into your cider. Put it in the bottles when you rack it off of the initial brewing, and you want to add a little bit of additional sugar to sweeten it back up. However, the yeast that are in there are not dead. They are just dormant, and so they will start eating that sugar that's in now in the bottles, that will create carbonation, which is great. But if they eat all of the sugar that's in there, you're back to having a very, very dry cider that doesn't have any sweetness to it. And you basically potentially are creating a bomb, because that's carbonation in there is just going to additionally pressurize that bottle, and knowing where that line is, where it's enough but not too much, is a very fine line. And that was something I was never really clear on how to get around or how to deal with when I was doing brewing before. And the trick to that is, again, pasteurization. So you backsweeten, you do some calculations, I'll walk you through that, in order to get some sweetness in the cider, but also to get some carbonation in the cider. And then once you think it's where you want it to be, which is usually, 4 to 7 days later, you actually pasteurize your bottles again. And so I'm using a flip top bottle, and these can take quite a bit of pressure, and you heat it up to 140 degrees for about 10 minutes, and that kills the yeast. But because you haven't opened the bottle, your carbonation remains, and any sugar that the yeast hadn't already consumed remains. And so it's a way of getting a nice sweet carbonated cider without having to do any artificial sweeteners. You can also use an artificial sweetener that the yeast won't eat as a way of sweetening. So kind of a brilliant technique. So I am very pleased with how this came out, and I'm happy to report, and I'm not quite sure why, it does not smell like feet. This is fairly young. It's only been in the bottle for a couple of weeks, but because it's around the holiday season, we've been to a couple of parties, and I brought a bottle to share, and everybody's had really good feedback. So this is not a super high-end, super complicated, very fancy hard cider. This is a kind of a quick and dirty hard cider, but it came out quite nice, and I'll walk you through what some of my thoughts were in terms of what I was putting into this. But what I really learned from city setting brewing is don't overthink it. It's going to be okay. These guys are great, and they often do ciders and different brewing from just bottles of juice at the grocery store. They've done some really fun yeast testing where they tested all different kinds of yeast in the exact same mix, and to see if they could tell the difference between the different yeasts. And the reality is there's subtle differences, but it's not huge. So that was kind of eye-opening, and essentially, yeah, it's just loosened me up to be able to feel a little bit more footloose and fancy-free about what I'm doing. And I'm looking forward to doing new ciders and new fruit wines in the coming year. So homemade hard cider. Let's get started.
So before we dive into the nuts and bolts of how to do this, let's talk a little bit about what's actually happening with fermentation. So the amount of alcohol in your finished product is based on how much sugar you start with, which is part of why you'll see me measuring the sugar content in this brew. The yeast then eat that sugar and convert it into alcohol and carbon dioxide. So that's the bubbles you see as things are brewing, and it's also the bubbles that go into the product if you have it in a sealed container that makes things carbonated. Each yeast has its own happy place, but in general, they want to be at about 15 to 17% alcohol. If it gets much higher than that, they start to die off. That's partly, fun fact, of why wines are typically in that range of alcohol content, because the yeast can't survive past that. If you want something higher test than that, you're going to have to actually distill it. And so don't think that you can just add a ton of sugar and end up with a super, super alcoholic brew. So in terms of equipment, you're going to need some way to measure the sugar content of your mixture. What you usually use is a hydrometer. You need some primary fermentation container that can be sealed and fitted with an airlock, and that can be glass or food-grade plastic. Some way of transferring a brew to a secondary container, and usually you use a siphon for this because you want to leave all that dead yeast and stuff that's settled out behind. And then containers to store your brew in, and those can be reused bottles. They don't have to be new bottles. And then some way of sealing those containers, either with a flip top or with a cork or a beer bottle top. And then mandatory ingredients. Obviously, you're going to need fruit or a fruit juice in order to actually ferment. And then depending on the fruit or fruit juice, you add water and additional sugar, depending on how sweet it naturally is. Most fruit by itself is not actually super full of sugar. And so a lot of times you have to add additional sugar, and there's calculations for that. You need some kind of yeast. And typically, if you've got a brew store anywhere near you, you can find wine yeasts, and that works for cider as well. Or you can obviously order stuff online. clean. And then you're going to need to sanitize everything, especially with a cider. The alcohol content is going to come in at usually between 5 and 7%. That's not a ton of alcohol. And with a higher alcohol wine that's in the 11 to 13% range, that alcohol is going to naturally kill off a lot of bacteria in other yeast that might be in the brew. And so it's going to be pretty shelf stable. Ciders are not that way. Beer is not that way. And so it is absolutely critical that you sanitize everything very, very well. And then as you get further into this, other optional ingredients that you typically find at brew stores will be things like pectic enzyme. That helps your cider end up more clear because it dissolves the pectin that might naturally be in there. An acid blend to help balance out the brew if it's super sweet and doesn't have a lot of tang to it. Tannins, same thing, adding a little bit of bitterness, a little bit of mouthfeel. Yeast nutrient, depending on the brew, sometimes yeast need other things besides just the sugar in order to grow and thrive. And so adding a yeast nutrient can help with that. And then in lieu of pasteurizing with heat, you can use things like Camden tablets or potassium sorbate or both, depending on the different processes, in order to sanitize or sterilize your brew so that there aren't any wild yeasts and fungus and other things in there that are going to give you off flavors or cause it to go bad. And that way, the only thing doing the fermentation is the yeast that you add and not the natural yeast that might be occurring in the environment. You can roll the dice, and sometimes you get interesting, good things with natural wild yeast, but sometimes you get very bad things and you get stringy, weird stuff that you just have to pitch. No affiliation with this product, but a quick Amazon search. This appears to be a pretty decent kit. It's missing a hydrometer, and I think you'd probably want to buy some Star San, and then of course you need the bottles to put the final product in. But this looks like a pretty good starter kit for most 1-gallon homebrew recipes. So here's our apple juice that I wanted to turn into hard cider that's been pasteurized on the stove to kill any of the wild yeast that are in it. And these apples were all pretty much sweet apples. They were sweet eating apples. And so because of that, I made a couple of tweaks to this recipe just to try to balance that flavor out a little bit. You're going to get a more complex brew if you actually use a mix of apples that are a little bit more tart and a little bit more astringent, what are called cider apples, but I didn't have access to those. This is a specific gravity hydrometer. So I'm testing the specific gravity of the original raw cider. So this is before it has been brewed. We start out at about 1.052. And if you have this beginning number and then you have your finish number, it's going to give you a rough idea of how much alcohol is in the brew. This is a Brix meter. And so I bought this for other things, but it's another way of getting at that same thing. And so here's plain water in the Brix meter and then our cider in the Brix meter, which is showing about 13% sugar. Because I only had sweet apples in this mix, we have a crabapple tree that has the most bitter crabapples on the planet. And so I threw a handful of those into this mix just to give it a little bit of that tannic. So this is the yeast that I'm choosing, Cote de Blancs. And what I've really learned is the yeast is not really critical. The City Stead Brewing people used bread yeast for like the first year that they were brewing. So it's not super critical, but this is a typical white wine yeast that's good for cider as well. I am blooming it ahead of time just to make sure that that yeast is actually active. So I wanted to see some foaming just in case. Here's our wild cider that I had left. I added just a tiny bit of yeast to that and then pitched the rest of the yeast into my now cooled pasteurized cider. I also added some pectic enzyme to help with clearing. I just followed the directions on the packet. And I added some mixed acid to try to make up for the fact that I didn't really have any sharp apples in that mix. So here's the first day, and we're just starting to bubble. I have this nice little measuring thing, so I look at temperature. The warmer your house is, the faster it's going to ferment. That has its pros and cons. Second day of fermentation, I'm getting a bubble about every 6 seconds, and then it was even faster after that. And within a week, this was completely done and no longer bubbling. So this is what it looks like after a week of fermenting. So now I'm going to retest that specific gravity, and I'm being careful not to pull juice from the very bottom of this bucket because there's going to be a lot of dead yeast and things down in there, but using a classic turkey baster in order to retest our specific gravity to see if we are fully fermented out. And we were indeed. This is a very active yeast, and it was a fairly warm house. And so every bit of sugar that was in that original brew has been completely fermented out. We are at basically zero in terms of sugar. Now, if I had done this correctly, I would have added a hose to this and avoided as much oxygen as possible. You want your original brew when you pitch the yeast to be fairly oxygenated, but when you rack it off of the dead yeast that are in the bottom of that barrel, you really want to not oxygenate it. This is actually where you can get some off flavors, but I was lazy and I didn't have a rubber hose sterilized, and so I didn't want to fuss with it. So we just very carefully drained it down the side of this bucket. And you can see that line of dead stuff at the bottom there. We're getting down to the very end here. And again, I should have used a tube and didn't. So here's the bottom of the bucket with all the dead yeast and the pectin settled out. Okay, so cider, if it's being judged, is judged in this way. Dry is considered less than 0.4% residual sugar, final specific gravity less than 0.002. Semi-dry has a little bit more sugar, so you've got a specific gravity between 002 and 004. Medium sweetness is specific gravity of 0.04 to 0.09. Semi-sweet, 0.09 to 0.19. And then sweet is considered a dessert cider, basically, and that's anything over 0.019. I wanted some sweetness in this cider because I find that if they're completely dry, you really can't taste very much of the fruit anymore, but I don't like my ciders syrupy sweet. And so I'm not really a fan of the typical ciders that you buy in the grocery store that I find to be very cloying and overly sweetened. And the rule of thumb is to change the specific gravity by 1 point, and that's 001, that point. You need to add 0.077 grams of sugar for every ounce of fluid. And so you figure out roughly where you want your specific gravity to end up based on where it finished, and then you add that much sugar back in order to get the amount of sweetness that you want. Now you can play with this, and really what they say is just taste it, and when it tastes sweet enough, you're done. And so you can just do this by taste as well, but I like to have a starting point so that I'm not just way over sweetening accidentally, because you can put it in, but you can't take it back out. And then in addition, I'm going to need some sugar that is going to result in carbonation. So I need to give those yeasts something to eat in order for them to create bubbles. And that calculation is you need about an ounce of sugar per gallon of fluid in order to get the carbonation. So way, way, way less than what you need to actually sweeten it to taste, but that also needs to be taken into consideration. So if you do both of those things, I needed 233 grams of sugar in order to back sweeten and carbonate this 2 gallons of cider. And there are charts online that walk you through this, and the people at City Steading also walk you through this, and that's where I got these calculations, but then I was also double checking some things online. And then make yourself a good cheat sheet, which is what I did, because you definitely can lose track of this and end up with the wrong things, especially because you're often going back and forth between grams and ounces, and that can be really confusing. So make sure you keep track of your units, but make yourself a cheat sheet in order to know what to do next time. And then I'm just adding in the sugar that I need and very gently stirring this in order to get it fully dissolved. We're trying a little taste test here just to see if the sweetness is where we think we want it, and it was. And then we're ready to start bottling. So in order to bottle this, I'm using Star San, and I use that at the beginning as well to sanitize all of the bottles that I'm using. This always throws me off because the stuff has a little bit of bubble to it, but it is a no rinse sanitizer. So from there, pouring all of our sweetened mixture back into the original bucket. And again, should have siphoned this, shouldn't have poured it, introducing a ton of oxygen here. So definitely rolling the dice on flavor. Don't do as I did. I wanted to just use this spigot to fill it. I do have a bottle filler, but this is so much easier. And again, just didn't want to pull all of my equipment out for this tiny little batch of brew. I like to fill my bottles to about an inch below the top. You want to have a little bit of room in there for air and for carbonation. And remember, this is sweetened at this point. The yeast in there aren't dead. And so that sugar that is now in the bottle is going to turn into carbonation. And some of it is hopefully going to just remain to sweeten our cider a little bit. Anybody else save like every glass bottle you've ever gotten that has these flip tops on it? I have a random odd collection, and I sometimes pick them up at estate sales because they basically never go bad. And you can buy replacement rubber for those little rubber orange pieces. And so if you've got one that's really old and cracked, you can just replace that part and the rest of the bottle is still good.
Basically almost a wine bottle.
And there you go. I ended up with 2 gallons of cider. And then when I bottled the wild cider that I was also using here, I back sweetened it with actual additional pear apple juice that I had saved. I topped this wild cider small quart jar with the very end of what was in this jar that I didn't have room for in the jars. And so we got a little bit of a mix here of both. But that wild cider just got back sweetened with additional apple juice. And it was a very volatile mix.
Cool, man.
So this is about a week later, and I had one of the wild cider bottles that I thought, before I pasteurize this, I should probably release the pressure. And so I opened it to release the pressure, and it rocketed out of the bottle like I'd put a Mento in a diet soda. So that's how much of that I lost. It went everywhere. It was in my hair. So it was very, very, very pressured. And so I ended up cooling the other bottle as cold as I could get it before I opened it to relieve the pressure so that it didn't do that. Cold reduces the amount of pressure in the bottle. So here I'm pasteurizing the bottles after a week so that I kill off the yeast. And you can see this bottle probably wasn't as sealed as it should have been. I imagine that rubber stopper was a little bit old, but you can see how much that's bubbling. This is a sous vide. You could do this on the stove with a thermometer. There's no reason you have to use a sous vide. I just happen to have it. But you want 10 minutes at 140 degrees in order to kill off that yeast that's in there. And then I'm siphoning off the hot water. And you can see these are bubbling. So a lot of that carbonation that's in there is definitely getting volatilized by that heat. And we want to bring that temperature back down in order to get that carbon dioxide to go back into that hard cider and not just immediately shoot off, you know, the difference between opening a can of warm soda and opening a can of cold soda. Once I had let them air cool for a little bit because I didn't want to shock the jars and have them break, I just threw everything into a sink with some ice water in order to bring that temperature all the way back down as much as I could. So cider is generally better once it's been aged in the bottle for at least a month, although it's certainly very drinkable right as soon as you put it in the bottle. So these have been aging for a couple of weeks, and we're hoping to have some of them for Thanksgiving dinner.
All right, you guys, this has been a pretty long video and a lot of information thrown at you. So don't feel like this is the end all be all and that you have to know absolutely everything from this one video. I've been playing around with this stuff for a really long time, and this is a quick overview of kind of what you need to know. There's a reason why really good brewers are really good brewers, because there really is an art to it, and it takes years of playing around and experimenting and learning in order to get something that is just, you know, really perfect. But you can very easily make a decent, fun alcoholic brew in your own kitchen without a whole lot of money and a whole lot of setup. And so that's kind of what I wanted to demonstrate here. And let's give this a try. So here's one of the ciders that we jarred. I don't remember the exact date. I'll put it on the screen, the day that we actually bottled this up. It's been sitting for a couple of weeks in my refrigerator at this point, and it's not perfectly clear, but it's settled out. There's definitely a little bit of residual yeast on the bottom from that secondary ferment that we did in order to back sweeten and to carbonate. But let's try a little bit of this and see how it is. Nice little pop there.
All right, so this is right out of the fridge. So this is probably around 40 degrees, maybe a little cooler than that. And obviously some very nice carbonation in there, even at a cooler temperature. So the back sweetening for carbonation definitely worked. Let's give this a try. And I am no expert when it comes to tasting brews. I don't have all the language. I just know whether I like it or not. But it has a yeasty smell. It does not smell like feet, which makes me very happy. And I'm not quite sure why, because we definitely introduced a lot of oxygen into this when we were putting in the secondary sugars. It smells yeasty. It smells fruity. It's really good. It's lightly sweetened. It has a little bit of bite to it, probably from that extra acid that I added. Not cloyingly sweet. My favorite brew that I've ever had in terms of cider is called Magner's. And we had that when we took a trip to England many years ago. And that's kind of like my happy place in terms of sweetening, which is about a 1.01, I believe. I was aiming for 1.009. So that's kind of where I wanted to be. And I think that's about where I ended up. It's very hard to measure the specific gravity of this at the end because the carbonation is going to make that hydrometer float. And so it's very difficult to actually get a good idea of specific gravity at this point. I probably could put it on a Brix meter and see what the residual sugar showed, but honestly, I don't really care. I just know that it's at a nice level and that I like it. And I kept decent notes so I can repeat this if I want to. But yeah, homemade apple cider from fresh crushed apples that we did this fall. A very successful experiment and one that I will definitely be doing again in the following year. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you like this kind of content, give me a thumbs up, subscribe, leave me a comment and share. I have new content coming out every week. Cheers.